Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm really hoping you're healthy and happy. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a virtual conversation on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today's discussion, Biden's inheritance, domestic and foreign policy challenges in 2021 and beyond, really couldn't be more relevant or timely. Tomorrow, Joseph R. Biden will become the 46th president of the United States, arguably facing the greatest set of domestic and foreign policy challenges since Franklin Roosevelt, without, I might say, the benefit of a world war that left America stronger at home and stronger abroad. Abroad, our image and credibility has been battered. Our influence and interests seem to be routinely challenged by powers large and small. And we face a determined set of adversaries and allies many who see us as weak, unreliable, and erratic. I still think we can lead, but you know the famous line that a leader without followers is just somebody out for a walk. And that's going to be a serious issue as we move ahead. But it's at home, I think, that where we suffered the most. There's no single foreign policy issue or combination of issues, in my view, that are more threatening to the republic than the ones we face here. And I can count at least four. The greatest threat to public health since the great influenza of 1918, an economy that has been battered with real structural uncertainties, deepening divisions along racial, class, and political lines, and a degree of political dysfunction that goes well beyond arguments over policy, but now seems to be a kind of a galactic divide where millions of Americans perceive and conceive reality in a very different way than others. And you could ask the question, and I will, of our wonderful panel, how you can have self-government in a republic when millions of Americans are basically divided over the facts. In this case, a secure and free and fair election, which millions apparently refuse to accept. Not to depress further, but let me quote George Packer in his Atlantic article on November 4, when the results of the election were not yet clear. Quote, "There's no escaping who we Americans have become. This is the election's meaning. We are stuck with one another, see no way out and no apparent way through, sinking deeper into a state of mutual incomprehension and loathing. The possible exits, gradual de-escalation, majority breakthrough, clean separation, civil war, are either unlikely or unthinkable. We have to live and govern ourselves together, but we still don't know how." So is it really all that bad? I mean, we've been through worse, right? Civil War, the Great Depression. A year ago, I tried to convince a millennial before COVID struck that 1968 was actually a worse year than 2019. No sale. Isn't America resilient? It's recuperative power not to be underestimated. You have a new administration, a new healer-in-chief, one party controlling both the Senate and the House, new vaccines and new hopes. So I guess the real question before I introduce the panel is this. Is this an inflection point, particularly emblematic of which what happened on January 6th in the Capitol, that's going to transform our politics for the better? Or in the immortal words of the late John McCain, is it always darkest before it becomes pitch black? Fortunately, I don't have to grapple with any of these questions. But we're honored and lucky to have three wise humans, really wise humans who can. I should say at the outset that George Packer had to cancel. He's not well. He'll be back at a future date, and we wish him well. But in his place, we have the inestimable Norm Ornstein, who is an emeritus scholar at AEI and a contributing editor at The Atlantic. Norm's books include The Broken Branch, It's Even Worse Than It Looks, and One Nation After Trump, a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. Dan Balz, who I've been reading closely lately, is the chief correspondent at the Washington Post covering national politics, the presidency, and Congress with real authority and perspective. And finally, the wonderful Danielle Pletka, who I've known for decades, great clarity and honesty in her analysis, is a senior fellow in foreign and defense policy studies at AEI, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy generally, in the Middle East specifically. 5 minutes each, 20 minutes of annoying questions from me, and then some cues from the audience. We'll conclude at 11. Norm, since I know you have to depart a little early, can I surrender the virtual space to you?
Thanks, Aaron. It's a real pleasure to be with you and two wonderful friends and colleagues. So Ron Klain, the incoming chief of staff, sent a memo to his senior staff that to some degree echoed what you had said to start, Aaron. He said we're going to focus immediately on 4 crises: the COVID crisis, the resulting economic crisis, the climate crisis, and the racial equity crisis, which also, of course, interacts with the COVID crisis in some ways. I would add 2 that follow also on what you said. One is the democracy crisis, and another is the governing crisis. They're related, but they're not quite the same. So the democracy crisis, before we started, you and Dan and I were reflecting a little bit on the fact that we had all been downtown. And to me, it was like being in the green zone in Baghdad. It's not like anything we've seen here before. I've been to a lot of inaugurals, as I think all of us have. And, you know, there's a festive atmosphere usually. There's some security. You have to go through metal detectors before you can go down onto the mall, onto the lawn in front of the west front of the Capitol. But there's never been anything like this. And the fact that the 25,000 troops, the National Guard and others coming in, all have to go through an FBI security check because we're a little bit worried about an enemy within following on this insurrection effort at the Capitol on January 6th, tells us that we're in a very different place. If you have a whole lot of people who deny the legitimacy of an election and then basically try and deny the fundamentals of the political system, and we know there are more out there, and we know that a significant number, certainly not all, are tied to white supremacist or white nationalist groups, which brings us back to the racial equity crisis and to the fact that the racial divide, which has been healed in some respects, here we are talking the day after Martin Luther King holiday, but which is deeper in others, is also related to democracy and to governing. Now, on the governing side, you know, after we had this violence at the Capitol, which one could argue came dangerously close to having our government toppled, having a significant number of our leaders killed. There were some who were out to do that, and that included the Vice President of the United States. That 2/3 of House Republicans and 1/4 of Senate Republicans still voted, in effect, that Joe Biden's election was bogus. And how they can work with him and govern after that is a real challenge. Now, yesterday, the incoming majority leader of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, and the outgoing majority leader, Mitch McConnell, reached a deal. The deal is that the Democrats with 50 seats in the Senate and the vice president, who will be end up spending a lot more of her time back in her old digs than in her new ones, more time in the Senate chair than in the Oval Office, will be able to set the agenda. The committees are going to be evenly divided. We don't know yet whether this deal includes at least some understanding that not everything will be filibustered, as we had seen in the past, that the committee chairs, or at least a majority, will be able to have some subpoena power, the ability to hold witnesses in contempt if they won't come, because there'll be a fair amount of that. But we also know that for all of these crises, there will be a real challenge in governance. What Biden can do, how much he can do with executive power, and whether the Supreme Court, now with 6 very conservative members, will step in to put some constraints there, We know he will take some immediate steps that my colleagues, I'm sure, will talk about, including some in foreign policy. And he will try and do more with dreamers and in other ways with executive power. But what can he do legislatively with 219 out of 435 Democrats in the House, and with a 50-50 margin in the Senate, and with a COVID crisis that's going to get worse? And that means that if any of your own members end up in quarantine or with COVID, you could have a very different lineup when you need those votes. Now, I would say finally, on the bright side for Joe Biden, and with Democrats in the Senate, and with that filibuster still in place, and it will be for some time, there is this budget process called reconciliation. It was used for the Bush tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. It's what enabled the Affordable Care Act to get through with just the 60 votes that they needed to bring it up, and the 50 votes in the Senate. And it was used for the Trump tax cuts. And it can now be used for a fairly large package that can include infrastructure. If he can't do a COVID relief package without a filibuster, he can do it in that fashion. And the good news for him at this point as well, and I'll conclude with this, is that Joe Manchin, remember 50 that go from Bernie Sanders to Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin yesterday said that he would not necessarily be averse to the $1,400 checks going out as part of a package, but the most important thing was a $3 or $4 trillion infrastructure package. And if Joe Manchin is up on an infrastructure package and an economic relief and COVID package combined, that can be done with 50 votes in the Senate, Biden might be able to get a quick and big victory, which would set him off with some momentum going forward. Just one final comment, which is the impact of those two Georgia elections. Right now, the most significant element is that he can move his nominees through relatively expeditiously. And if you don't have your own people in place, especially with a whole lot of really bad Trump people who are still going to be there, you would find your presidency deeply crippled. Can't hear you, Aaron.
Aaron, you're muted.
I am muted.
Now you are.
Now you're not.
All right. For you, Norm, that was a remarkably upbeat presentation. My spirits are buoyed. Dan, can I turn it over to you?
Sure. Thank you. Norm has covered the waterfront exceedingly well, as he always does. So I'll pick up on a few things. Obviously, the tension that Biden faces is the question of his desire for unity and, to some extent, bipartisanship. His promise that he's going to try to work across party lines, as he's always done as a senator, and the role that he often tried to play when he was vice president for Barack Obama. I mean, I think that's part of his DNA. It's the way he thinks about things. It's the way he approaches things. And I believe that certainly it is a genuine impulse on his part to want to try to do that. But as Norm lays out, in a 50-50 Senate, and with the House as narrowly divided as it is, he may have to resort to, the use of reconciliation, which will inflame divisions between Republicans and Democrats rather than help to heal those. That's a big choice he has to make, and we don't quite know where he'll go on that, but one would almost bet that in the face of the problems that he's having to deal with, that reconciliation becomes the route. I think that of all of the things we've talked about, the most immediate and pressing issue is what he's able to do on the pandemic. Until that is brought under control, and until the distribution of the vaccine is fixed and the supply is significant, that problem looms over everything else. You can begin to try to do something on the economy, but dealing with the pandemic is first and foremost, and he's going to be judged on that, given everything he has had to say about how badly the Trump administration has dealt with it and the promise that they are going to do better. So I think they're well aware of that. They seem to think that they've got some ideas in place, but everything we know about the kind of challenge says we have to be skeptical that they will be able to move as quickly as they hope. If they are able to, that's a big feather in his cap. But I want to go back to the other big problem, and I separated it, as Norm does, from the governing issue, and that is the democracy issue. Biden said at one point after what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, that the work of the next 4 years has to be the restoration of democracy. That is a noble sounding goal and ambition, but enormously difficult to do given the state of affairs that we have. As Norm said, when you have as many Republicans, particularly in the House, but also in the Senate, vote in favor of the objections after the Capitol had been ransacked, that tells you something about the state of the Republican Party and the degree to which this is both a broken party and a party that's still in the grip of President Trump. We do not know how Trump will conduct himself once he's out of office, but we know that people will continue to look to him. And even if he is not as visible or active a force, and I'm not predicting one way or the other, what he has embedded within a part of the electorate will continue and will remain. The issue of white supremacy is now front and center on the kind of the agenda of the Republic, and how Biden chooses to deal with that, how directly he confronts those things. I was reading both Roosevelt's inaugural address and Lincoln's first inaugural address yesterday, and both of them were very direct in what they, and where the way they addressed the main and central issues facing the country. For Biden, he can choose to say it's these domestic challenges, pandemic, the economy, the racial reckoning, those sorts of things, or he can look at the bigger problem, which is a democracy at risk and a democracy in potential peril. And we don't know at this point how actively or directly he wants to go at that issue, and whether there is any solution to that in the short term. I mean, this is a problem that has been festering, that has broken through in the last year, particularly, and certainly anybody who had any doubts had to be awakened by what happened on January 6th. But now this is an issue that can't be ignored anymore, and this is the challenge for the new president. So the choices are very difficult. He has direct problems that he has to try to solve, and he has a very big problem with democracy that will affect the way he's able to govern, no matter how the internals of the executive versus the legislative branch begin to play out. We did some polling late last week, and one of the things we found is that the Republican Party, still does not see him as a legitimate president, or at least a substantial portion of the Republican Party does not. A overwhelming percentage of the Republican Party members do not have confidence in Biden to deal with these issues. These are the obstacles that he has to confront. So it is, Aaron, as you said at the beginning, a set of problems that no president has had to deal with collectively. And on top of that, this major issue of the threat to democracy.
Dan, thanks. Both Doris Kearns-Goodwin and Ken Burns both have referred to the fact that not only does Biden's challenge almost rival FDR's, but they're both mentioning the Civil War as well. So that issue of democracy is going to be absolutely critical, and maybe we'll get some clues tomorrow. Inauguration speeches don't usually lay out policies, but maybe we'll get some clues tomorrow on how directly the president-elect is prepared to confront that issue of white nationalism and dysfunction in our political elites. Danny, I leave it to you, and I'm hoping that you'll, since this is your real area of expertise, that you'll also touch on the challenges that the president-elect will face abroad as well.
Thank you, Aaron. Can you guys hear me?
We can.
That's the most oft uttered phrase. You're on mute. Can you hear me? Great. Thank you. First of all, really, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm used to being in the minority on a panel, and it's really nice to at least represent half of the constituency, with Norm having AEI and dominating Carnegie, our next door neighbor, really at this panel is a great honor for us. So look, I think you asked the right question, and I want to talk about foreign policy because that is both what I know and what I care about. But let me take a couple of seconds on the comments from Dan and from Norm. Look, I think that all of us look at what happened on the Capitol and the president's exhortation of violent, aggressive, white nationalist, extremist crowds as a horror, as an affront to our democracy, as Trump's first genuinely impeachment-worthy action, and that's something that's going to hang over the Congress and over the first days of the Biden administration, which is something we may want to talk about in our chat, because I think it is going to be it is going to be a in some ways unwelcome, even to the Biden folks. But two important points. I, who spent a lot of time on foreign policy and on democracy building and on those sorts of things, think that the talk about threats to our democracy is a little bit overdrawn. One of the things that we notice, even in the presence of these outrageous crowds, even in the presence of the fact that we have to have National Guard on the streets, again, all sort of hugely distressing and a terrible reflection on those who represent that threat. Nonetheless, when you look at our election, what you see is a system that worked. You see a president that didn't respect it and that used his henchmen, I think I can use that word, to try to overturn it as best he could, who was rejected repeatedly in dozens of cases, winning only one technical small case, who had a Supreme Court, which is, as you all mentioned, is a 6-3 conservative majority that simply wouldn't even hear from him, wouldn't begin to consider the case. You have Republican officials, Democratic officials, you have at the state level, who all affirmed the integrity of the process. And even at the Capitol, where we saw terrible people and we saw a very weak Capitol Police force not do a bang up job in defending our members and our vice president at a critical moment in our democracy. But even then, we saw the process go forward. We saw them come back at 8 p.m. They did their vote. For me, this has been an affirmation that even though there are people who seek to threaten, who will do their best, who have no scruples. Sorry for the dogs. Our democracy is robust, that we have good guardrails, and that I think should be heartening at a difficult time. Maybe a silver lining. Second thing, we talk about the difficulty of all of these Republican voters, and I'm a Republican voters who don't accept Joe Biden, who think the election was stolen. I don't think the election was stolen. I represent, I suspect, a large majority of people, but even if I don't, let's just hark back to the resistance. Donald Trump was legitimately elected as president of the United States. Hang on a second. Lizzie, shut up! Thank you. YouTube crowd, don't hesitate to comment on that one.
That's the first, Danny.
I know, it's bloody life at home. I can't get the dogs to shut up. Anyway, but this not my president, which people put on their Twitter profiles, this resistance, that was loathsome. Okay, that was loathsome. And that was a repudiation of our democratic process. That's not to defend Donald Trump in any way, but it is to suggest that these shoes are worn by others than simply Republicans. Okay. Now, just needed to get those 2 points out. Finally, let's talk about foreign policy, because there, America rightly is obsessed with itself, and especially during the COVID challenge, I think that is going to be front and center for President Biden, and that's completely right. But that doesn't mean everybody else just goes away. The world continues to turn, and he has the challenges that honestly face Donald Trump. They're very similar And I wrote an article a couple months ago in which I argued that Donald Trump has actually bequeathed a lot of leverage to Joe Biden. One of those pieces of leverage is not being Donald Trump. That's a huge amount of leverage. You're going to be polite. You're going to be nice. People like you better. Not to sound like Sally Field, but people like Joe Biden. Awesome. That gives him some leverage in national security policy. And one of the things that Trump's policies will enable Joe Biden to do in the cases where he wants to go forward is to try to set the terms a little bit more favorably to the United States. And by that, I mean to Biden's standards, not Danielle Pletka's standards, not Donald Trump's standards. We have absolutely crushing sanctions on the Islamic Republic of Iran. The right course is for Biden, as he has so far done, is to say, I wish to return to the JCPOA, the Iran deal, but I can't do that unless you guys do a few things. We got some terms and conditions here. And again, don't look at me, don't blame me. That was Donald Trump. But I can't just leap back in. You've got to show me some good faith, right? He's going to wait a long time for the Iranians to do that. They just imprisoned and sentenced yet another American, a dual national in Iran. So they're sending exactly the opposite signals. Similarly, on China, I think the Biden administration is coming in with a review. And I hope and I believe actually that is an intelligent course. And I think one of the things they want to do is try to separate out the different challenges that we face. Separate out the human rights challenge that we face in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs from the South China Sea, from the threats against Taiwan, from the trade issue. One of Donald Trump's worst sort of mundane sins was that he viewed everything as leverage on everything else. Trade is leverage on human rights, is leverage on foreign policy, and that's not really how it works. While they can help, that's a good idea. Similarly, Biden is going to be bedeviled by Vladimir Putin. And that is not just sort of attempts to interfere in elections, it's attempts to interfere in his own near abroad. It's biting off pieces of territory of other countries. It is the arrest of Alexei Navalny and his colleagues yesterday that the United States really, needs to take a position on, because we see backsliding in Russia that is terribly troubling. I could go on for ages here. There is the problem of Turkey in NATO, Turkey in the Middle East, Turkey as godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood. There's the challenge of what to do about, the Israeli-Palestinian problem that we talk about. I like to think that Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, apparently for life, called elections because he sees now as a moment where he needs to change and actually satisfy the demands of the Biden administration. But I think, look, on foreign policy, I think there's a lot of opportunity should the folks who we all know and respect inside the upcoming Biden administration actually use those opportunities wisely. There's tons more to say, but I don't want to suck up all the oxygen in the room. And so go to your 20 minutes of annoying questions, Aaron. You're muted, dude. Nope, still muted.
You reach a certain age, you can't figure out how to unmute.
You fall farther and farther behind every day. Let me ask, before we come back to foreign policy, let me ask Dan and Norma a question. We've got this iconic standard of 100 days. You can do a lot in 100 days. You can go on an exercise program. You can learn to reprogram your VCR. I mean, there are many things you could do in 100
I'm not sure you can learn to do that in 100 days.
I can. So
you can learn to unmute.
My question is, realistically, given the fact that this is anything but a clean transition, and you have the I word, which essentially impeachment is going to become serious, and even if it succeeds, it's going to require time, oxygen, effort, and it will prove to be somewhat of a distraction, not only in terms of time, but in political capital. How do the two of you, Danny, you as well, see the impeachment coinciding, conflicting with the Biden 100-day agenda. Norm, can I go to you first?
Yeah. So what I would say is, first, we don't know exactly when they're going to start this. Speaker Pelosi is going to work with Biden and with Schumer to determine the timing of this. She can wait a while. I suspect she will. I think she'll wait at least until they can get through some of the confirmation hearings. And remember, we're not just talking about the cabinet. We're talking about a huge number of other people, sub-cabinet officials and otherwise, that you want to get through. You can do them while you're doing an impeachment, but it's difficult. I would guess they're going to take a little bit of time, but then they will bifurcate. And you'll have some people in the Senate who will be working on the initial investigation. And, you know, a whole lot more information might come out about Donald Trump's involvement with some of these groups and with some of the members of Congress who might have been complicit in this, that would add power to that particular investigation. But I would assume they're going to do morning business and spend 6 hours a day doing legislation and confirmations, and 6 hours a day doing impeachment. And it'll probably take 3 to 6 weeks. I would add just one other element here that relates to more broadly to the question of democracy. You know, in non-democratic countries, you punish your adversaries when they lose. We have not tended to do that. But frankly, the issues here go beyond Donald Trump. There's a lot of serious questions involving some of his family, involving some of those in the cabinet and others in the administration. And the question of how and whether you handle those things may be just as important, including how much it creates difficulty governing. But with all of that, I'm less concerned about how much the impeachment process is going to impede all of this than I am about the much larger questions of how you gain control of a government. And the 100-day standard finally is a bogus one. It's one we've used, we continue to use. It doesn't reflect what success or failure there is in an administration, but it's a construct we'll continue to apply, I'm afraid.
But in the end, doesn't this come down to McConnell's calculation, and won't impeachment to some degree run again? If McConnell mobilizes and decides that the president should be impeached for moral, ethical, and practical reasons, because then the Senate could go on, if they choose, with it by simple majority and bar him from ever holding federal office. How does that relate to his power, his authority to support or facilitate a Biden agenda on discrete issues, if that's his broader strategy? Or is this a just say no response in order to somehow position themselves for 2022?
So a couple of comments I would make on that front. One is, I think Mitch McConnell's initial statements about Trump and impeachment were designed more to try and pressure him to resign early, which would have been the cleanest way out of this for everybody. And that obviously didn't work. Apparently, one of the reasons was that Trump didn't trust his vice president to pardon him after he left office, which also tells you something. But now it's a dilemma. Both parties have their dilemmas. I think it's a real dilemma for McConnell and for others in the Senate, because there's still a very substantial share of the Republican base that believes in Donald Trump and would see going against him in any fashion as traitorous, as treacherous. But if you don't get distance from Trump, you're going to continue to be defined as a Trump party and a guy who left the presidency with the lowest approval rating ever.
Dan, a thought or two on this one?
Picking up with what Norm just said, the Republican Party is two parties at this point. It's the Trump party and the I won't say never Trump party, but the non-Trump party. And McConnell has clearly cast himself as part of that non-Trump party since the election. He did much to facilitate things that Donald Trump did prior to that, but he's made clear that he reached a limit with him. But the statements that he's made, both privately and or publicly, about impeachment seem to me to be a holding pattern. and that he is going to weigh very carefully which direction ultimately he wants to go. Certainly, I don't think there's any way that there would be a conviction without McConnell leading the Republicans in that direction. But the question of 2022 is also very important. I mean, we know the history of recent elections. Almost every election that we've had over the last decade or slightly more has been a change election. 2006 was a change election, 2008, 2010, not so much 2012, 2014, 2016, 2018, 2020. If you are a Republican and you are looking at the numbers in the House and Senate, you have to say to yourself, if we play our cards right, we will have control of one or both of those chambers 2 years from today. And the question is, what is the best way to get there? Is it just firm resistance / obstruction, which was the strategy that McConnell and the others instituted during the Obama administration? Or is it, let's play along on some of the things and draw lines on others in order to try to figure out what the coalition we need to try to get back into power? So those are questions that McConnell's going to have to deal with and answer. For Biden, because he and McConnell do have a relationship, it's going to be a bit of a chess match between the two of them as to how much they're willing to cooperate with one another and where they're not, and the degree to which there is a real rupture when they are at loggerheads, or whether these are, in the nature of things that senators, people who have been in the Senate a long time, as both McConnell and Biden have been, know how to maneuver through. But again, because we're dealing with a Republican Party that is as divided as it is, this is a different set of calculations that both McConnell and Biden will have to face.
Norm referred to the fact that Kamala Harris spent a lot of time over in Congress, but it just occurred to me that Joe Biden, am I right here? Since LBJ, Joe Biden is the first president who literally is his entire career was made over there. So I'm assuming that, like LBJ, that could be something of an advantage when it comes to pushing this through. Danny, you're a self-described Republican, and I don't want to burden you with trying to, entangle the future of the Republican Party. But how do you see it? How do you see the future of that party?
I think both parties are in the throes of the Democrats' generational change, and the Republicans in the throes of some I would say more substantive in some ways changes, and that a lot of people still don't understand. I look at the Democratic Party and I see one of the big challenges, in addition to figuring out how to deal with a 50-50 Senate and a very close House. I see the challenge for the Democrats being managing the party's far left, right? How are you going to satisfy at the same time, the balance that you want, the Joe Bidens, the Kristen Sinemas, and the Bernies and the Elizabeth Warrens and the AOCs? Now, that's going to be very difficult to do, especially in a closely divided Congress. For the Republicans, I look at the members, and let's just set aside, everything we dislike about Donald Trump for a second, as hard as that is, and recognize that he put his finger on something that was hugely meaningful. I mean, he got elected president the first time round. He came remarkably close for a man of his ilk the last time, right? Talking about tens of millions of people voting for him, including increased constituencies of African Americans, of Hispanics, of Asian Americans. So, trying to figure out that magic without the unbelievable disruption, lawlessness, and contempt that Trump has for pretty much everything, is a real riddle for the Republicans. And I think that when you look at people who are behaving in a weaselly way, or what appears to be a weaselly way, for them, they're looking forward and they are asking themselves, how do I speak to that constituency, without actually being a scumbag? That's not easy, not because those people are scumbags, but because they can't figure out what the appeal exactly was, what Donald Trump's secret sauce actually was. And I see that. You see that in the choices that people are making, in both poor choices, but also in the hesitation that they have to alienate people because they don't really know.
Aaron, let me just.
I know you have to run soon, Norm.
Well, I want to follow just on some of the things that both Dan and Danny have said. I do think 2022 becomes a critical election for the future of the country and for the future of the Republican Party. If you go back to the strategy that was used when Bill Clinton became president, the first 2 years in 93, 94, that Newt Gingrich applied, and the one that McConnell and the so-called young guns in the House Republican leadership applied for the first 2 years of the Obama administration and for the first 2 years of his second term. It was a remarkably successful strategy. It was unite as the equivalent of a parliamentary minority party, vote against everything, block what you can. If you can't block it, as with the Affordable Care Act, delegitimize it, try to delegitimize the president, get the party of the president demoralized and your own party angry, and look what it reaped. The first Republican majority in 40 years in the House with Newt, the largest gain of seats in the House in 100 years in 2010, the recapture of the Senate in 2014. If the Republicans win back the House and Senate in 2022 and using the same strategy, I think the conclusion is going to be, hey, we know what works. We just had a lousy guy, and if we can find another Donald Trump, but a smarter version of it, we'll be fine. And that takes us, I think, further away from having two problem-solving parties. The Republican Party is going to be a very conservative party. The question is whether it's a Trumpist, populist, authoritarian-leaning party that is more inclined to stick it to the enemy than it is to figure out how we can govern, or a conservative party that says, all right, let's use our principles to try and find ways to solve our problems. If they lose in 2022, then I think you're going to see some traction given to the forces within the party, and that might be the Liz Cheney wing of the party. It might be some of the Never Trumper elements, the Bill Kristol elements, who will get some traction and begin to pull it back. This is going to be a real challenge. And obviously, it's a challenge to McConnell to figure out whether that same strategy works. And it's a challenge to Joe Biden and to Chuck Schumer to figure out how they can navigate through all of this.
Before you go, Norm, I have to ask this question. Again, quoting Packer, who argues we become two separate countries. Neither can conquer the other, and neither is going anywhere. How do you get at the essential problem in which millions of Americans, millions, not hundreds of thousands, perceive reality and conceive reality in a fundamentally different way than millions of others? How do you run self-government? What changes that in order to create some bridge, not the extremes on either side, but some bridge among the mainstream so we can return to functioning institutions and functional governance? That's a session for about 10 other Carnegie Connects programs, but just a thought or two, Norm, and then to Dan and Danny, and then I want to get to some audience questions and some foreign policy.
This is a huge, huge problem that we have on a couple of fronts. I will say that I believe that Joe Biden is the right person in the right place at the right time as a president, because he is a fundamentally decent person with enormous empathy. I know from my own personal experience with him, having suffered a tragedy, that Biden reached out, and that's the genuine Joe Biden. And that will make a difference, I think, with a significant number of Americans who may be on the fence a little bit, That decency is going to be really important. And I think the genuine desire to try and be the president of all of us.
Mm.
At the same time, there's another large problem, which is in the modern information age, where disinformation and phony realities and the willingness of people at home and abroad, and this is certainly a problem in both areas, to manipulate it to their own advantage. The ability of malign forces that used to be more isolated out there that can develop communities now because of social media and act on that front. All of that is going to continue. And, if you think about what the framers had in mind, the Congress, which comes from the Latin word meaning to come together, you bring people together face to face. They have different perspectives because they come from different places representing different people, and they debate and deliberate on a common set of facts and organically try and come to conclusions that will be broadly acceptable. If you don't start with that common set of facts, governing becomes extraordinarily difficult, and our political system is not designed to deal with it. And, we're going to have to muddle through with this for a period of time. And because you have people who see this in an existential way and who have weapons at their disposal, we have to fear more violence. Remember that the violence at the Capitol was preceded by a plot to kidnap and assassinate the governor of Michigan. A group of people who occupied the Michigan Capitol all over the country now. We're protecting capitals. This is not the sort of thing that we've seen in America for a very long period of time. And it's a challenge that we can't ignore or downplay.
Norm, thanks. Dan?
I'll have to go, and thank you.
All right, Norm, thank you, Norm, so much.
Thanks.
Aaron, I think Norm's point about Biden is instructive, which is that he has the combination of decency and empathy, and I think respect that goes broader than the Democratic Party alone. People who've known him who are Republicans, I think, have respect for him. That is an enormous asset, but it's not one that has instant results. That is something that is going to have to, in a sense, kind of bleed into the system, bleed into the body politic. And that will take time. Perhaps that is the long-term value of him being president, but in the short term, it doesn't instantly change a lot. Norm's point about the threats of violence, I had a conversation last week with the historian Eric Foner, who's a historian of the Civil War and of Reconstruction. And he said, one thing to remember is that before the Civil War, we had a civil war, which was an increasing acceptance of violence in the United States in the 1850s, on both sides, he said. And the fact that there seems to be some of that creeping back in, or maybe not more than creeping, is a cause for concern. I'm not trying to be apocalyptic about this, but I think that what we have seen is that there is at least a part of the country, again, and I don't want to overstate the size, but a part of the country, a part of the electorate that is looking in those ways. So Biden will have to try to calm things down. That was part of his appeal as a presidential candidate, that he would bring some period of normalcy. And I think normalcy is not, going back to, 10 years ago or 20 years ago, but it is simply a different tone and a different environment than we've had over the last 5 years of the Trump candidacy and presidency. So that is that's the tension within the Biden presidency. How much does personality, temperament, empathy, how far does that go to change the tone and begin to get people to think differently about this? But the fact that we do have totally different, media ecosystems, the degree to which people just see the world differently, and frankly, the agendas from the left and the right being almost incompatible in the way people see the solutions to these problems. This is not something in which you kind of can do the traditional split the difference, go 50%. These are deep and abiding differences, and I think that both at the federal level, but also at the state level, we're going to see, Republican governance looking different than Democratic governance, and those things are going to play out as Biden is trying to solve these major domestic issues. Things are going to be going on in the states that could go in a different direction.
Right. Danny, we have many questions actually for you on foreign policy. So we've got about 10 minutes left. Let's see. Anne asks via email, what do you think will change other than rhetoric, with respect to Biden's China policy?
I want to answer Anne's question and look in my crystal ball, thereby proving that you never learn your lesson about making predictions. But I want to say something first about the question that you asked, because I think it's really important. If the Biden administration and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi decide to go forward with pushing everything through on budget reconciliation, ending the filibuster, trying to allow DC into the union as a state, potentially Puerto Rico, trying to increase the size of the courts, any of those things, that's going to be the end of any comity at all. And I also think it will mean a crushing defeat for the Democrats in 2022, Donald Trump notwithstanding. If the Democratic Party continues to prosecute culture wars over prioritizing the issues that we've talked about here today, which are far more important. If what becomes the battle is, who gets to use what toilet and what pronoun you use, we're going to have a very unpleasant time, because the issues that we've talked about today are areas where there can be bipartisan compromise, where there should be bipartisan compromise, where a lot of people who voted Democrat or Republican believe that we need responsible governance, COVID, healthcare, recovery, all of those things. If it's anything else, then it's going to be a circus again. That's the only thing I would say as a matter of prediction on that question. On China, for Anne's question, and I'll try and keep this succinct. I think that a lot depends not on Joe Biden, much as it did not depend on Donald Trump. This is much more about Xi Jinping. Okay? And I was telling Aaron before we got on screen, the podcast that we host, What the Hell is Going On, the most aptly named podcast on the face of the earth, had John Podesta on. And John said exactly the same thing. Xi Jinping is creating a situation that the United States must respond to that's much less about Biden, much less about Trump. And it is going to require whoever is president of the United States to act. So I see very little likelihood of stepping back.
And on Russia, what sort of leverage or influence could Biden have with respect to changing Putin's calculation? Notwithstanding President Trump's soft spot for Putin and other loathsome dictators and would-be dictators, the truth is that policy-wise, over the last 4 years, the United States has put in place a series of pretty punishing sanctions on Russia, on Putin's cronies, on Russian banks, on Russian organizations, both weapons and others. So theoretically, Biden will have the leverage to be able to offer to lift some of those in return for better behavior. The problem is that Putin's behavior isn't being driven by the United States. It's being driven by his own domestic exigencies. It's being driven by him externalizing the threat in order to diminish the appearance of problems at home. And no Joe Biden can change that. My biggest hope is that Joe Biden can bring the Europeans, the incredibly recalcitrant Europeans, along for a much sterner approach. Maybe we can get them to smack down Nord Stream 2, which Donald Trump tried and failed to do. Maybe we can get the Europeans to have tougher sanctions on Russia, enough to get Putin to sit up and take notice. Thanks. Dan, it's a well-known sort of axiom that when presidents get bogged down in domestic troubles and travails, both the Constitution and the reality of the fact that the president, unlike the Supreme Court or Congress, doesn't go in and out of session. The president is the 24/7 Energizer bunny of American policy. Could you see a situation? Let me rephrase. How much political bandwidth do you think the president will have to pursue not just low-hanging fruit, rejoining Paris Climate, the WHO, mending ties with the allies, but taking on some of the more difficult issues? Does that have political resonance, even though the D's control the Senate?
Well, as important as those issues are, I think that the domestic agenda is paramount at this point. Now, Biden's instincts will be to do as much as he can on foreign policy because it's, in a sense, what he knows best,
Right.
And what he kind of naturally gravitates to. I mean, I think the first thing we will see, in addition to kind of the, as you describe it, the low-hanging fruit, will be an effort to basically say to, the European allies, we are back and we want to be partners with you in addressing the kinds of issues that Danny was talking about, particularly on China and on Russia, and presumably also on Iran. But as Danny said, the terms of getting back into the JCPOA are different than they were before Trump got out of it, and so he has some maneuvering room on that. But this is a period. I mean, COVID has made every country somewhat more nationalistic.
Right.
Every country has to resolve the problem within its borders before it can fully address those outside. Now, there are going to be issues on foreign policy that he can't avoid, but I think that the main steps will be the more symbolic and the easier ones, and then taking his time and dealing with the knottier ones. But pandemic, the economy, and figuring out how to govern in a divided and essentially two Americas environment have to be his main focus.
Right. Last question before we conclude. I have one thing I'd like to say. Is there any intersection that resonates politically for the vast majority of our fellow citizens with respect to foreign policy? I mean, it's an elite within the Beltway issue. Carnegie's done work on foreign policy for the middle class. I know Jake Sullivan feels strongly about this. The intersection. Where is it trade? Is it diversifying supply chains? Is it job creation? What's the one foreign policy issue that would most resonate with
Who are you asking?
terrorism and an oil embargo? Although we don't have much to be concerned about there, at least for us. Is there an
asking?
That's for you, Danny.
That's for me. I think this is a word I absolutely despise because it is at once meaningless and infantile, but it works in this regard. I think where you see resonance, and Donald Trump was shrewd about this, is fairness, right? Yeah. And that goes for foreign policy as well. One of the things that Trump really got was that we brought China into the global trading system, into the international community, in order to harness China in these rules of the road. And China took those rules of the road and exploited them and disregarded them where they wanted to.
Yeah.
And he got that. And I think that's one thing that does absolutely resonate through the country, through the classes, and beyond the think tank elite on Massachusetts Avenue that you and I inhabit.
It's good to know. I want to conclude, first of all, by thanking you and Dan and Norm and Abstentia. I want to conclude with a quote I've used before, but on the eve of this inauguration, at an inflection point in our country's history, Lincoln, addressing the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838, said the following: "At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all of the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point then is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, It must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I want to thank you, both of you again, and Norm as well, and our audience for tuning in. May 2021 be a much, much, much better year than 2020. Take care, and thanks again.
Bye-bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron.